Well, there was a student applied to the University of Texas. She was white, and she didn't get in, and she claimed it was a reverse discrimination.
Well, what is reverse discrimination, Mark?
Well, that is when someone who's not a protected class, right, who's not, have the history of being discriminated against, they end up getting discriminated against, because they're not a protected class.
Well, I understand we have a caller on this. That's somebody that studied these cases very well. And who is that, Mark?
Well, we have Ramona Maboob coming on, and she's looked into this, and she's a student herself, so we thought we'd bring someone in who had some perspective, in that area.
Okay, is Ramona on?
Yes. Hello?
Good evening, Ramona. How are you?
Good. How are you?
We're doing really well. We really appreciate the time to come on to our show. So why don't you give us a brief background of this case and see if we can get a handle on it?
Yes. This case, the Fisher v. University of Texas, there were two students that applied to University of Texas, and they did not get in because university had some preferences on taking black students. They could not get into the university just because they were white, and there were some other black students that were not as qualified, and they got into the university. So they sued the university based on reverse discrimination, and the case went off to the Supreme Court, and we are waiting for the final decision by Supreme Court on this case. The importance of this case is that the result of the case, whether it's for Fisher or for University of Texas, would have an effect on affirmative action. So, if Supreme Court decides for Fisher, it's possible that affirmative action could not be exercised throughout the universities. And if University of Texas wins, it would give more value to affirmative action.
Ramona, my understanding is, wasn't there something in this case where when a student was applying, on top of their application on the first page, it said what their race was?
Yes. As a matter of fact, one of the matters that the Supreme Court judges were noticing, and university later confessed to that, was on the cover page of the application, before the application starts, they were asking about the race of the student.
So don't you think, Ramona, don't you think that's a good way for the university to promote diversity? So, when people go to a university, they get experience from different cultures, and you have diverse races, you have diverse cultures there. And so what's the problem with the university, looking at this and saying, the front page of the application and saying, okay, this person's of this, of this race, and then taking that into consideration to who they admit?
Because, the race would then have the main effect on the rest of the application, meaning that a person that's looking to the application would consider race as the main factor in accepting or not accepting the application. And, this is discrimination based on race.
But
Okay,
excuse me,
Go ahead.
Ramona, I have a question for you on this, though. Doesn't the school have a motivation to serve the community and to balance the students that they admit to their campus?
Well, what happened was the university did multiple things that, the Supreme Court judges thought was a discrimination and was against, the equal protection we have in Constitution. One was, we just discussed that they were asking about race on the very first page, or on the cover page. The second was that they were trying to, to put more, students from certain races together in classes. and they would conduct surveys asking questions such as, do you feel isolated? From minor students or, certain races, they would ask them whether they feel isolated in the campus. So Supreme Court decided or thought that what they were doing was actually racial discrimination. And
Okay, so Ramona, what you're saying is they had a program, kind of a follow-up program, because they were going in there. Because isn't it true that some people have argued that, like, say someone gets admitted, like say someone gets extra points or extra consideration because of their race, and then they get into the university and they have a hard time competing. Isn't this something, a mismatching? Isn't that an issue that comes up sometimes?
Oh, of course. Accepting people based on their race and making it a major factor in accepting or not accepting them, is not a very scientific way of admitting people.
So, but isn't this survey in this program? Wasn't that survey in a way to try to follow up and try to mitigate that mismatching problem somewhat? Maybe mitigate that. So, even there was a little mismatching, then they could come in, maybe mentor those students or help them and give them a hand so that the mismatching didn't become a problem. How could you think that's a bad thing?
To help students to get into certain programs because they are from certain race. Do you think was that your question?
Well, what I'm saying is, okay, sometimes it seems to me that this survey was meant to, follow up on people who got in maybe because of a preference, right? And they wanted to make sure they're doing okay, so they didn't feel isolated and left out. And there is, and I don't know if that was in response to mismatching, but I think it might well be. So how would you argue that that's a bad thing? Wouldn't that be a way of kind of helping that problem?
Well, what they were doing, asking students, whether you are, whether you feel isolated and putting them into certain classes to match the racial demographics of their classes with the racial demographics of the state. The Supreme Court said that, first, what you are doing is problematic. It is considering race as a main factor in, putting students together in a class. And secondly, you are claiming that what you're trying to do is matching the racial demographic of the university with the racial demographic of the state. And the state of Texas has 1% black population. And these universities, and this university had, well over 1% black population.
Okay, Ramona, I wanted to thank you for coming on the show tonight, and I really appreciate all the input. And we're going to watch this to see how this turns out. But Mark.